Hello, I'm Nikhil.
And I'm Shankar. This is Chai Across Generations. This is episode 16, Arranged versus Love Marriage.
We kicked off our series on marriage last week with a discussion around what marriage is, how different generations relate to it, and the pressure that young people feel as a result of generational or cultural differences. If you haven't listened to that episode, you can go back and check it out. And even if you haven't, you can also just jump into this conversation since it covers different topics.
We received some good feedback and lots of questions coming out of part one of the discussion, so we'll cover some of these at the end of this episode.
But let's first get into the main course for today. The bulk of today's episode features part 2 of our conversation on marriage that extends from the last episode. We discuss arranged versus love marriage and the role that astrology plays in the process. Is it all in the stars?
We'll come back at the end to wrap things up. Here we go. My first thesis is that to think that it was arranged for everyone is, I believe, a misunderstanding and a misconception and a misinterpretation. Right. Right. But then, hopefully, in this conversation, as we go along, I'll talk a little bit about also why it came that way. It's not like I'm bashing only on it. I think there are some very good points about it. There's a lot of wisdom in it too. But I think it really depends on the child involved, the person who's going to get married, and the parents,
Right.
and the quality of their discrimination and understanding, and their, you know, to go back to my good old litmus test is the guna balance. How sattvic are they, or how rajasic are they, or how tamasic are they? Depending on that will depend whether it's arranged marriage is going to work, or
Right.
self-chosen swayamvara is going to work. And so I think that's kind of how I see it. But to flip it over to you, I've talked a lot about some of these things from the long past. How is that sitting with you after, as you re-examine?
Yeah, no, it's very resonant. It's very resonant. I think it's a good bridge into this idea of arranged marriage versus love marriage.
Right.
And an arranged marriage being it's set up by the family, it is chosen by, say, the parents more than the child. That's on one. It's a spectrum, right? That's maybe arranged marriage at its core. Love marriage, on the other end, would be no input from parents. You go, you make your choice of who to marry. You marry that person. Your family's, you're not really considering your family, right? There are shades in there. There's a shade, I feel like, of more love marriage, but with an arranged marriage flair, where people are set up by their parents here, right? Are introduced.
Right.
South Asians are introduced to one another through their parents, through their communities, through mutual friends, family friends, etc. But the two people are ultimately making the decision. There is a flavor where maybe the parents have more of a say, right? Or kind of the kids want their parents to consent and to meet each other and to come to some consensus about the union before they go forward. So, we can't talk about it as two entities. It is a spectrum, right? What came to mind when you were speaking is that I used to think as a kid that arranged marriage was kind of like not good, not the proper way to do things, not the way I'd want to live, and love marriage was more of the way I'd want to do things.
Right.
Right? And in reality, it's way more nuanced than that.
Right.
Where there are elements of both that we can learn from and should learn from.
Right.
And there are potential downsides or pitfalls to both.
Right.
And I read this book called The Newlyweds by Mansi Choksi, which is a beautiful examination of 3 stories in India of people choosing a love marriage over an arranged marriage. These 3 couples are in different contexts. I believe one of them is between castes. One of them is a Hindu-Muslim pair, and one of them is a lesbian couple. And so they kind of examine how this plays out. It follows real people. And it's a fascinating story because it shows you that love marriage doesn't always work out, right?
Mm-hmm.
And just because you have choice does not mean that it will end up in a better decision necessarily.
Right.
And especially when you make that choice to do a love marriage in a society that wants you to have an arranged marriage, it can really complicate things. Things can get very messy. It's a little different here if you're growing up in America or outside of India, but
Right.
this story examines 3 couples in India. And so what came to me is we have to really examine both arranged marriage, love marriage, make our own decisions about what works for us and what we can take from both, because there is wisdom in your parents, in your elders being able to help you, absolutely. There's also wisdom in making your choice, taking your time, picking and being intentional. I believe you need a mix of those two, and where any one person falls will depend on them.
Yeah.
But I think at a cursory glance, if you don't think about it to that extent, you can easily fall into a dichotomy of do you believe in arranged marriage or love marriage?
Right.
And that's too simple, I think, of a way to look at it.
That is so wise, Nikhil. Gosh, you're. I'm just amazed at how much maturity and depth you have. That's right. That's right. It's not one or the other, right?
Right.
It is a continuum, right? And I would give it a slightly different perspective of saying that it's really a balance of what I might say will or individual choice and guidance,
Right. Yep.
right? And I think you're right that both are important because no one person is completely self-aware,
Right.
right? And your parents do have this sort of, if not a 360, they know a lot about you, fair enough, right? And there's some wisdom in taking that input, right? But I think you're right. It's a unique choice for everyone, but I yeah, I think a good combination of one's will and guidance can give a good result, right?
Right.
And it's somehow, I feel it's how self-aware one is and how much it is in alignment with what I'll call a certain natural flow of events, like they say Tao or Rita. Like, how much are you in alignment with that? And if you are, then I think it's going to be an outstanding success. But somehow, if you're not aware of that and you go against the flow too much, definitely your will can overcome some things.
Right.
I'm not saying no. I think there are couples who may challenge the social norms and mores of the communities in which they live and still make a go of it and still have an outstanding marriage. And I think that's possible. But how much can our will overcome is also something to give some thought to. If there is the overwhelming wave of sort of the natural order of things going in one way, how much energy do you have to keep paddling upstream of that is something to think about, because we all have finite energies.
Right.
Right. So having a nice combination of one's choice and will with the guidance, I think, can have a very good result. And that may fall anywhere on the continuum, right? It may fall very much towards the love marriage side, as Swayamvara. It may fall very much more to the arranged marriage side. So I think it's so beautiful that you brought that up. It's I'm just amazed. Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. I think you're deepening my understanding too by thinking about the fit between 2 parents and a child, let's say, or a parent and a child.
Right.
That's maybe an overlay on top of, guidance. The answer between how much guidance or will you choose for the marriage you want to build will also depend on the qualities, the chemistry between you and your parents, right? What you believe you can rely on, what you believe you can trust. And one thing I learned recently, I was reading some books on dating, and one thing that struck me that I wasn't doing earlier in my life was it is really important. The opinions of the people that love you, your loved ones, your parents, your close friends, is really important when you're trying to find someone.
Right.
And I read a suggestion in a book that said when you should have your romantic partner, if you are serious about them and are thinking about maybe marrying them, have them meet your parents, your best friends, whatever it is.
Mhm.
And then after they've met, ask them, what did you think about me when I was with this person?
Right.
Not what did you think of this person? Because they will tell
Right.
you, um, they were great. No one's gonna. They don't know that person, but they know you. And
Right.
so I think it's a good illustration of seeking that guidance
Hmm.
about you and about how you are showing up, within the relationship in the presence of the other person. So that's a little tip, I think, no matter where you fall on the spectrum, as long as you're
Right.
having some ability to choose, you
Yeah.
can find ways to ask questions to incorporate the input of other people without having them choose the partner for you, right?
Right.
There's value in that, and that is a push toward the guidance side, even if it's more anchored on the personal choice side or the will side.
That's very beautiful. I think that's a really nice tip. Thank you, and it would be very valuable for someone who is in the process
Right?
of finding a partner and then maybe introducing them to their family and loved ones. I like that. I like that. Going back to the bit which you really pointed out, this parent-child chemistry, the parents-child relationship is absolutely spot on, right? If we can approach it in a place from a place where the parents come and say, look, whether they say it in words or not, but their affect is, look, you're an adult, you have your own wisdom, you're intelligent, and we're going to respect that, right? You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And when the child has that confidence, then it may feel comfortable to say, look, I would really value your guidance
Mm-hmm. Right.
because I can see that you respect my intelligence and my ability to choose as well, right? In our generation, what happened is, at least I felt, this is very much a personal thing. mm, I felt my parents were completely out of touch with the rapidly changing nature of marriage itself,
Mm.
how people were choosing their partners, right? It was changing, and it was no longer arranged and all that, right? And I think for me, so this is another peculiar, interesting thing. I don't know if you want to dive into it, but I'll jump into it and we'll see where it takes us, right?
Yeah, let's do it.
So my visceral reaction against arranged marriage was the whole astrology thing.
Mm.
Okay. So I was very much a rationalist, and very enamored of science and technology and the modern liberal viewpoint when I was growing up, right? And I just could not believe that anybody would use this as a tool to find your partner, right? And I think my reaction was so visceral that that's what convinced me that no way, I'm not going to do this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now we're going to come to see an interesting twist and turn as I have grown and matured and deepened my understanding of various things. So we'll see if we get to that. But that's an integral part of South Asian and particularly South Indian marriages, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is the idea that the astrological charts have to be plotted and matched, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of the beginning of a sort of vetting or a compatibility check, right? And then of course it's a matter of family and stuff. And along those lines, I'll also say that observing weddings and things like that, there is some truth to the fact that family culture, the stratum, the class, these do play a role. I mean, there's that, suddenly this quote popped into my head, uh, there's something from Shakespeare about being an impediment to the union of two pure hearts or something like that, right? I mean, nobody wants to say that these things should be an impediment to the
Mm-hmm.
union of two hearts that love, but in a practical sense, they do come into play. You see that even at the wedding,
Mm.
which is if there's very large disparity in any of those in the families, it starts to create a bit of an uphill battle. It's not insurmountable, but slowly things add up as you grow older, because in the early years you're very enamored of each other, and everything is fresh and new, and it's there's physical attraction, and there's the just that carries one for a good period, some period of time, right? But then um, in a lifetime there are different seasons, and then the like I said, the non-enjoyable parts may surface, the liberating parts, and then the question of how do you deal with that, right? and
Right.
and and how many external obstacles are you going to create, because that relationship, for it to mature and become very strong and deep, it's sometimes easier if there are lesser obstacles, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's some of that. So how are those two things falling in your thinking, the astrology part and the family's compatibility part?
Yeah, I think you have hit the nail on the head on both. The
Okay.
astrology part, I'm moved by the fact that it is such a big part of the process.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like there has to be some wisdom there to be gained. But where
Mm-hmm.
I pause a little bit is when people start making decisions based solely or primarily on the astrology part, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, Especially when it's a no, especially
Mm-hmm.
when it's, oh, this pair won't work out. Let's say,
Mm-hmm.
these two people fall in love, they come to their parents, they say, we want to get married. The parents look at the Jatagam or the astrology and they say, this isn't a good match.
Right.
What do you do from there, right? Like,
Right.
should those two people not get married? That
Right.
feels, I don't know, I'd be hard pressed to make
Right.
a decision on just that.
Right.
And again, everyone's going to come to their own kind of answer there.
Right.
Um, what was the other part again? There was the astrology piece, and then there was the family dynamic piece, right?
Right. And the
I think
compatibility of families.
yeah, I think that's a very astute point and one that
Mm-hmm.
is under considered often. Um,
Right.
I need to think about it more because there's probably some acceptable range of difference, right?
Right. Right.
As long as you're within some similar range, and I think this is where values come in. If you have similar
Right.
values, if the way that the two families show, let's say, affection or appreciation or just the things they value, let's say on a vacation, in raising children and raising grandchildren, if those are similar, then I think you're set up to have a village to support you in a marriage.
Right. Right.
It's a good point, though. It's probably something to vet in some ways and to
Mm-hmm.
consider as you're looking at a union. Um, my mind went somewhere else too as you were talking, and I'm happy to go into that. But let me just pause there first and see if you have any reactions to what I've said.
No, I like it. I like it. Let's follow your thought.
Yeah, so one thing you're helping me see in this conversation and making me question is how much wisdom can we learn from an older generation on a topic that is as personal as marriage,
Right.
right? And maybe it's a question I'll just pose for all of us to consider. And the reason that I bring that up is because this ties back to the idea of societal pressure. But I think
Mm-hmm.
there's this notion that people in our society know when and whom you should marry, or the type
Right.
of person, the type of profession. I also want to mention you and I are talking as two men.
Right.
The female experience is vastly different,
Data front.
and
Right.
I cannot speak to it completely, but from talking to women about this topic,
Right.
the pressure is higher. The
Right.
age by which you're expected to be married is typically lower.
Right.
The idea of being past your prime happens
Yeah.
way sooner for women. Even the idea of being like a proper woman
Mm-hmm.
seeps into a lot of these discussions, and it's this idea. I think going back to the idea of previous relationships, I
Right.
think there's an idea of if you're a woman and you've had many previous relationships, you're somehow looked at as more questionable than a man who's had many previous relationships, which
Right.
doesn't make
Oh my gosh.
sense, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a double
Yeah.
standard. I fully reject that, but it's absolutely there. It's
Right.
absolutely there in
Right.
these discussions around arranged marriage. If when two families are chatting, it's
Right.
there even in the context of a love marriage, let's say, and parents maybe are looking at potential partners for their or meeting potential partners for their children. Like, these are
Mm-hmm.
mindsets I think we have to be aware of and hopefully shift.
Yeah.
But if we can't shift them, at least be aware of them and the biases that we have. Um, and so maybe where I'm coming to is there's so much judgment and fear
Mm-hmm.
when I think about what my elders tell me about this topic, right?
Right.
It's not all of my elders, to be fair,
Right.
but
Right.
societally speaking, there is
Mm-hmm.
a sense that if you're not married by this age, you're not going to get to live a fulfilling life.
Right.
Um, if you don't marry a doctor or engineer or lawyer or whatever, you're not going to have enough money.
Right.
Um, and I don't know. I'm struggling a little bit with this because I want to respect my elders and
Mm-hmm.
respect that viewpoint, but it's it's so restricting, right?
Right.
It is
Right.
so much putting something in a box. And I'll give you one more example that has been playing in my mind.
Mm-hmm.
When I went to India last summer, I went to at one point I was visiting a distant relative,
Mm-hmm.
and this person is older, probably in his 60s, 70s, um, and pretty traditional. Comes from a village. So
Mm-hmm.
at one point he asks my mom how old. He says, how old is he?
Mm-hmm.
20, and he guesses that my age is 24.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not married. My mom says, oh no, he's 29. And the look on this guy's face
Mm-hmm.
is a mix of like shock, awe, anger, all in one. And he
Mm-hmm.
says to her completely seriously, he has to be married by the time he's 30. You cannot let
Right.
him get to 30 and not be married. What he
Right.
didn't know is I was 2 weeks away from turning 30, so there was
Right.
no way that I was getting married by 30. But you kind of nod politely and you say, okay, respect your elders in that moment and move forward. But
Right.
I'm struck by this sense that this person who lives
Mm-hmm.
a world away from where I live,
Right.
um, feels like he has this wisdom about how I should live my life when I should get married.
Mm-hmm.
When my world is completely, I don't know, like on the other side of the globe.
Right.
So I guess there is the point of the judgment and fear and the prescriptive nature of what the older
Right.
generation might tell you. And
Uh-huh.
then I'm trying to wrestle with how do I relate to that?
Right.
Because there's a part of it that is like I just fully reject parts of that. But I
Mm.
want to be respectful as well.
Right. So a lot of stuff, Nikhil. You've opened up so many different threads. Um, I think a central one that I'm picking up on is how much can we learn from the older generation.
Mm-hmm.
Right. That seems to be a central part of it, and I am sorry for the embarrassment that you went through there, and I know that sometimes it's even a lot worse, particularly for women and things like
Yep.
that. That
Absolutely.
is um, that is insensitive, but I'll try to maybe answer that there can be wisdom, but sometimes maybe it's not being communicated very effectively and at all in a palatable way, right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
So and so maybe I loop back to my own uh, visceral reaction to astrology, whereas you had a much more balanced reaction.
Hmm.
And I want to share with you and our listeners that I actually now have a 180-degree different approach to astrology. Okay. So through my own effort, meditation, we call it sadhana in our, tradition. I have come to actually believe, and not only believe, but know that there is a power to this approach.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, there's a wisdom to it, there's a system to it, there is an influence. And is it perfect? No. And so my objections to it were really a bit naive and immature at that age. And I'll tell you what my objections were, which is like, okay, let's consider all the astrological predictions and let's look at all the marriages and let's map how many of them are successful, right? And if they're successful, then this tool is good, and if they're not, it's not good, right? And there's no data, or there's very little data. It's hard to collect data, right? Fair enough,
Right.
So it's a very empirical, scientific approach. But today I ask myself another question, which is, let's look at medical science, right? Does medical science have a cure for cancer? No,
Right. Yeah.
not at this point, right?
Right.
Does it stop me from taking a Tylenol when I have a headache?
Yeah,
No.
there are limits to it, right?
There are limits to it.
Right.
So similarly, it's a system with some limits, right? So if I go to an astrologer, am I guaranteed that he's going to tell me that I'm going to have a perfect match? No, obviously not.
Right.
That doesn't mean that I should not use it as an auxiliary system with a very wise person who might have insight into that to
Right.
consider it as a factor. So I've changed my opinion 180 degrees from before. And I'm just very glad that you had a balanced opinion to start with. Maybe I should have talked to you when I was younger.
You would have caught me.
Traveled.
Yeah, you would have caught me at you would have had to use time travel. Otherwise, you'd have caught me in my early, I don't know, teens or something, or younger.
Right.
But no, that's a really wise point. And if we go back to the situation I proposed of two people fall in love, want to get married, their parents check the astrology. The astrology says maybe they're not a good fit. What do you do?
Right.
It's one input, right, into a decision. And I would just maybe caution folks from saying, well, throw it all out at that point. But it might be something to consider. It might be something worth investigating. And for that couple and for those families to have deeper discussion about, right, to see what might fit.
Exactly. And actually, when you go deep into the nature of astrologers and astrology itself, right, again, there are the sort of tamasic astrologers, and they're the types who sow fear into you, right? If you go to an astrologer and say, if you don't do this, this is going to cause you this, run away from them, because they're the worst kind.
Right.
The ones who monger fear and all the other negative emotions, right? They are to be avoided at all costs because they don't know. They're not the deeper ones, right? The mid-level ones are the ones who will say, who'll try to cater to your greed. Okay, they'll say, do this, you'll get lots of money. Run away from them also, is my opinion. The top ones, right? The top ones recognize that to every situation, there is a solution. Okay? There is a way out. Okay? It may not be easy. Right? It may require tremendous self-control on your part. Right? And they'll just caution you that this path is hard. And there are ways around it, but most of them involve self-control.
Right.
Which we have in limited supply. And so what they're saying is that given your inclinations, this is going to be a difficult path because your personalities may clash on these topics. Right. That is the sort of evolved, right? And very often, like the really good ones, right? Usually they will couple that with they call it an upayam or a pariharam, which is a remedy. And the remedy is usually devotional. It is to invoke take the spiritual path, go and talk to a guru, deepen your devotion to God.
Right.
Essentially become more humble, become softer, don't use harsh words. This is the kind of wisdom that they'll give you.
Right.
And they're the top ones. And believe me, you go to a therapist and you talk today, you get the same advice.
Right. Yeah.
So they were actually the old therapists.
Right.
They were looking at your personality match and saying, these things are going to be friction points, guys. Watch out.
Right. What I really like about what you just said is that it's a relationship, and what happens, how it plays out, is not destined. It is developed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I think that's so powerful. Because I to your point, if we as consumers of astrologers can take a look and say, this means this match will never work.
Right.
Right? Therefore, cut the ties, let's move on, right? And
Right.
at tremendous personal expense sometimes of the people involved, right?
Right.
And I think
Right.
we can't do that. And thinking back to my question for you of how can I relate to an older generation that is being very prescriptive about what I should be
Mm-hmm.
doing,
Mm-hmm.
maybe that's a part of it. Like a lot of the advice, it's not even advice, it's just like directives, is based in fear. Get married by
Right.
30.
Yeah.
That's not a useful heuristic for me if it's
Right.
just based in that. If there's
Right.
reasoning I can understand, I'm happy to engage in a conversation on it, but if that is the extent of
Right.
it, sorry, it's not for me.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
just have to kind of let that slide. That wraps up the second part of this discussion on marriage. We'll discuss our biggest takeaway from this episode and also a couple of listener questions coming out of part one. Shankar, what's your biggest takeaway from this episode?
Yeah, Nikhil, I really liked the bit where you said that asking our loved ones what they think of us around a partner versus directly asking them, an opinion on your partner is a really great suggestion. And it's practical. And gosh, I wish I'd thought of that before. So I love that. And I also observed that this podcast is opening up a lot of hard questions, such as the one you posed. What can we learn from our elders? Which is like a, you know, $64 million question. And so I'm going to pass on that. What did you take? What did you take away, Nikhil?
Yeah, my biggest takeaway was your comment about the different types of astrologers and how the best astrologers realize that to every situation there is a solution. I've generally assumed that astrologers operate in this realm of black and white, but your answer helped me see that there can also be an acknowledgement of that gray area and that the best astrologers do acknowledge some of that gray area.
Mhm.
Um, it also helped me come to the idea that relationships aren't destined but developed, which was a really positive and life affirming viewpoint that has kind of stuck with me since we talked about it.
Actually, I do like that phrase myself, that they aren't entirely destined but developed. Um, so I did want to also pose the question for you from one of our listeners. Are you ready?
I'm ready. Let's go.
Okay. So the question for Nikhil from one of our listeners is, why do you see marriage on par with birth and death?
Yeah, and to remind our listeners, I'd mentioned on the last podcast that there's these three big events in our lives. You're born, you're married, you die. And I just wanted to clarify, so my point about these three big events in life was not that this is how I view things, but rather I believe this is how society views things. Because when you look at the big ceremonies that we celebrate in South Asian culture, these are the big three. There are several other smaller ceremonies, but I think these are the three biggest points. I actually think, my personal view, that there are many other important events, such as finding a career, finding one that balances what you're passionate about with what you're good at, what you can get paid for, having kids. Those are all really big moments in my opinion too.
Mhm.
So maybe hopefully that clarifies a little bit of where I was coming from.
Yeah.
But this actually leads me to another point, which is that I think our society pays a lot of attention to the wedding and less on the marriage. I think the long-term marriage is way more important than the wedding, but the wedding is the moment in time that gets all this attention, right? We joke a little bit about how big Indian weddings are, South Asian weddings are, and it's completely true. I feel like we should invest more time in creating a great experience throughout the marriage than focus on making that one point in time as big, as exciting as it can be. I think we'll talk about this a little bit more in next week's episode too. So hopefully that satisfies some of our listeners.
No,
Um,
I'm glad you had the chance to clarify, and it makes a lot of sense. And you're absolutely right. Yes, those are the biggest events, and fair enough. Um, I also like your point about thinking more about the marriage in the long term sense, and not just focusing on the wedding. I think those are both great points. Yeah.
right. Because something I feel is that I'm not sure I want a big wedding.
Hmm.
I feel like it's more important. It's the start of something
Right.
and not as big of an event as a big wedding would have you believe. So, yeah, that's maybe another viewpoint I'm realizing I'm coming to here.
Hmm. Yeah.
Okay, my turn. A question for you, Shankar, from one of our listeners.
Uh-huh.
What is marriage to you? How does it begin, sustain, and end?
So, first of all, thank you for picking the hardest questions for me.
Of course. My
So,
pleasure.
so I think I did talk a little bit about this. So I do think it's both companionate and enjoyable, meeting of minds, meeting of soul, meeting of the heart. Um, Definitely all that. How does it begin, sustain? Peculiarly now, I think it really begins with a strong sense of being able to communicate with that person and to feel that you can support each other in a more non-judgmental way. I think that's very important, and I think when that actually happens, the openness and growth and communication without judgment, I think that's how it will also be sustained. How does it end? Hopefully, it doesn't end, before one leaves the body. That's my hope. But sometimes, yeah, unfortunately, I mean, that's at least for me, speaking for myself. But I do acknowledge that in some cases it needs to be revived. Perhaps it's like any living thing. I think you have to supply it with all the elements of life, and that's an ongoing project. Is too long is too whatever, but an interest, I should say, more like an interest in life.
Mm.
But I think it does also it feels effortless when it's right.
Mm. Yeah.
So, how does that
Yeah.
satisfy? Yeah.
I like it. I really like
Hmm?
that answer. One thing that was coming into my mind as you were saying that is if you look at the chemistry of two people, I think
Hmm.
that probably is a huge element of how it begins. And I think a big piece of that is communication.
Right.
I actually think a lot of the topics we've covered come back to communication.
Yeah.
And that series, a lot of those elements are very relevant in these other podcast episodes. Um, I also think there's an element here of having an equality of, or a similar view on different values. And for example, gender roles and what we
Hmm.
expect of each person, um, I think is also shifting and has shifted over generations.
Right.
But, for me, if I think about a marriage, finding a partner where maybe we are both equal in that sense, we
Hmm.
can do some of the same things. It's not as clear as, or it's not as partitioned as the woman is in the kitchen and the man earns, but rather both should be able to kind of lean in and support the other person.
Thank you. Yeah, more fluid. I get it. Is that right? Is what you were saying in that
Yeah, the
last?
ability to
Yeah.
flex up and down as a couple, I think, is important
Right.
for me when I think about marriage.
Yeah. Well, thank you. That all of that does resonate. So, Nikhil, one last question for you before we are done here. How many cups of chai have you had today?
Shankar, is this your question or is this a listener question?
It's my question.
Oh boy, I think you got me today. I have had 3 cups of chai today. My mom is visiting, so we've had lots of cups of chai. I'm feeling very wired right now. These are very strong cups of chai too.
I'm
I'm
go-
decently caffeinated right now.
I'm going to renegotiate our contract now. There's going to be a limit on the number of cups of chai you can have before you come.
It's good. This is good to talk about and to communicate clearly about.
Anyway, we'll be back next week for part 3 of our conversation on marriage. So don't go too far.
As always, subscribe to our podcast and please leave us a review on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
See you all next time.